Great panel. Thank you very much, Mark. So we're going to do a quick transition here as you guys exit the stage and we bring up our next panel and shift our focus a little bit to another area that is very important to us at RTCA, and that is global harmonization. As many of you know, we work tirelessly to make sure that we work with our counterparts in Europe and around the world, and especially that we have established an even closer relationship over the last several years with ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. And so for this next panel, we're bringing up some of the leaders from around the world who really spend their time working these issues. We're very lucky to have Richard McFarland, known to his friends as Maka, to moderate this panel. He is someone I've known for as long as I've been at RTCA. I think I first met him at a dinner with then head of the Air Navigation Bureau, Nancy Graham. I think he had just come from his home in Australia just to be here for a little while. Fortunately for all of us, he's still here. His resume will tell you that it covers the areas of CNS, ATM, aeronautical information, meteorology, and airports. It also says it is tasked with putting the international enabling provisions in place for programs such as CARATS, NextGen, and CESAR. Now, I think that's ICAO speaks for helping the countries around the world modernize their air traffic control systems in a harmonized way through things like the Air Navigation Plan and my favorite acronym, the ASBUs. MACA has had a lot to do with putting together plans that all of the countries in the world, no matter what level they're at, can be able to do the modernization that is commensurate with their needs and in a harmonized way. So we're fortunate to have Maka here to introduce the rest of the panel to you and talk a little bit about our global leadership and global harmonization. So welcome. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Margaret, and welcome everyone. A bit of a change in pace from the last panel. And the team up here today is really to become your voice. So we've got 2 members from the industry associations and 2 from the standards making organisations. And the idea is for you to lead into them, what should those organisations be asking of the standards making organisations, and for the standards making organisations, what can be done and what can't be done and how fast. So I'm hoping, Andy, you're going to be able to put up a way to get questions to us, and we will use your questions to interrogate this panel. I'll start off with just a couple that I had to warm things up, but the intent is for you to bring your questions forward to our panel. So just to start from my end, I've got Peter, Christian, Al and David. Their bios are in your agendas, so we won't go through all of those. Most of you know them pretty well. I'll just start from this end and we'll start from the far end and we'll get underway. So for David, followed by Peter, because you're the 2 organisations that demand the standards for us. My first question that I put down is, are standards really important to industry? Okay? Or is there a better way of doing things? And with your answer, I'd like you to delve a little into whether we are utilising them effectively in our current regulatory frameworks, and that's not just here in the US, but all around the world, and the timelines with which we are delivering such standards. So David, can I ask you to start that one off for us?
So I can just say yes and be done. Never follow the dancing bear, which is, I feel like, what we're doing after that drone. Very lively discussion. I mean, obviously the simple answer is yes. Standards are critical to everything that we do, and we have lots of great examples of where they're being used effectively, right? In what RTCA does in terms of avionics are used, quite widely and effectively by all of the manufacturers that we represent. But I think that when we really get down to it is, are there enough of them? Are we moving quickly enough? The answer is no. There is an insatiable appetite on the part of manufacturers for further standards that are obviously non-prescriptive, by the very definition of it being a standard, that our regulators will look to and adopt, which then requires two things to do. Number one is that the SDO itself needs to be moving quickly. But number two is the regulator itself has got to be very, very involved in the design of that standard. Therein lies another issue, which affects the timeliness of these things, is that different regulators have different needs. And quite often they're working with different standards organizations. So when we talk about harmonization and globalization, it doesn't do us a whole lot of good if EuroK and RTCA are working on similar but not the same standards, especially with different regulatory authorities.
Excellent. So what I'm hearing there is the timeliness is still an issue, and it's that performance-based versus prescriptive that's still an element for you. Have you got something to add to that, Peter?
I would agree fully with David's comments. Absolutely, we need it. Timeliness, I think, is of the essence. Our industry is evolving so quickly. Technology is being developed in such a speed, such a quick and efficient manner. Our industry is evolving quicker than it's ever done in the last 100 years. And we talk a lot about the US, Europe, which are our industry leaders. But where growth is going to take place over the next 18 years is not in the US or in Europe. It's going to be in the developing regions. And when we look to implementation and standard setting, those are the areas we need to really focus at quite aggressively, because that's where we're going to have the biggest issues on implementation, on safety, and efficiency. We'll always have the issues here in the US and in Europe, but it's more mature markets. We have experienced regulators, we have an experienced industry. But we're very quickly, we've already become a global industry with global players. And that's where we need to become much more focused. We need organizations like CANSO, ICAO, probably more than ever to take that leadership role. Because it's not Europe, it's not the US anymore, we have a global theater. And if we don't take those actors into play, Europe and the US will suffer.
Okay, great. So I'm really hearing here is the emerging markets we've got to be taking real cognizance of in the near future. Okay, so my question to you first off, Peter. ICAO has departed from developing prescriptive SARPs towards a performance-based approach. States, airlines and air navigation service providers have also evolved to commercial, corporatised and not-for-profit organisations, in many cases no longer managed by states. Do you think these changes had any impact on the harmonisation and implementation efforts?
I think it puts a burden on the system, no doubt. And we're seeing it on a global stage. We're seeing how regulators of states are offloading some of their ATC services to semi-private or private concessions, very similar to what Canada has done very successfully, or in New Zealand. And from an industry standpoint, we favor that. We think the services are going to be better. They're going to be able to modernize, give better service. But now the regulator takes on a much bigger role, a much more important role, and they have to react much quicker than they did before. And that's a challenge that we have throughout the world. When you have the regulatory bodies are somewhat slow to implement, and in this case, to regulate. And that needs to go hand in hand as these ATC providers go into the private sector, start modernizing, start investing. The regulator has to play a very important and aligned role with these new service providers, because we need to, again, ensure safety, efficiency, and reliability are met and kept, and also taking into account that we're implementing global standards and not local standards. And that's an area that we are quite concerned about, that we're seeing more of. Instead of implementing the global standards, we have states and certain providers who are looking into their own standards, and again, in a global theater, that just does not work anymore.
Okay, so I guess we're moving to the same problem that David mentioned earlier, with the standards-making organisations getting the input, but we're not transferring it into the regulatory business early enough to be able for the industry to take advantage of. Is that?
Yeah, we've had PBN for years. And you leave even in the U.S., we still treat it as a novelty in many cases. You go to Latin America, you go to Africa, it's a wish, it's a vision. And it's been around for 10, 15 years now. And we just heard in the past session about drones. Again, Europe and the U.S. have been very proactive. But one of the colleagues was saying, you could go to Best Buy, pick it up and buy it, and you're flying it. Imagine when you're going to other regions around the world where there is no standards, there's no processes, it's not on their radar. So if we're still struggling with PBN, and now we have drones coming in, that's a challenge that we have. And we're seeing it not only in the U.S., we're seeing it on a global stage. And that's our concern, because it's not an issue about improving efficiency or reliability, we're talking about safety aspect. And again, this is where global harmonization is so key. International organizations like ICAO need to step up, need to take the lead. And we need to make sure that it's done in a timeliness, because drones are here. Technology is advancing, and we're going to double in air traffic in the next 18 years. That's a given. Are we going to be ready for that? And we have to start now.
Okay, message received to the standards organisations. David, have you got anything to add to that?
The only thing that I add is, as we develop our standards, and we develop SARPs up at ICAO, and they have great programs around, a global air navigation system. It requires investment. The investment needs to be in the infrastructure of the member states, and not to allow differences. I think there's too much, we don't want to be prescriptive, but at the same time, differences puts the burden on the operators and the manufacturers in terms of coming up either with different technology or coming up with different procedures. Okay, and anytime you start introducing different technology, not new technology, different procedures, you increase the safety risk. So we have to make sure that as we work on these, up at ICAO and others, that we're putting in the necessary infrastructure and supporting the necessary infrastructure globally, because our aircraft fly all over the world.
Okay, thank you very much. And just a reminder, get your questions into Andy while I go to our seed questions for our two standards making organisations. Al, for you first. Big announcement recently with RTCA has just become an independent standards development organisation. So my question is, how will that affect your relationship with us at ICAO? How will it affect your relationship with your colleague beside you, Christian, and with, in fact, all the other standards making organisations?
That's a great question, and it is a very timely one, very topical. I think everyone in the room is familiar with the fact that as of the end of May of this year, RTCA is no longer chartered by the FAA to be a federal advisory committee. But it's important to remember that RTCA has a history dating back to 1935 in the development of standards. We were a standards organization for a very long time before we ever had the mantle of Federal Advisory Committee applied to us. That happened in 1975, and irony of ironies, RTCA fought that change. We did not want to be a Federal Advisory Committee. We wanted to be just a standards organization. We were originally chartered by the FCC in 1975, and in 1976, the FAA took over the charter, and we were operating under a 2-year charter ever since. When we saw that this change was coming, and it's important to recognize that RTCA had a political half and the standards half, and it seemed obvious that the NAC and the DAC charters were going to be taken into the federal government, and the FAA was going to administer those charters. We and several of our members approached the Department of Transportation, and we asked them and laid out the reality that the standards development organization is much better as an industry group, industry-run group. And we were surprised, well, not surprised, but there is actually an OMB circular out there that advises the federal government that if there is a standards body that is industry-run and recognized, that the government should join that body and not try to form its own. And so with that reality and with the membership encouragement, the FAA saw very clearly that the standards development organization of RTCA was not broken, and so they wanted to keep it going in the format that it is. So the good news is our relationship with ICAO, our relationship with EuroK is actually probably going to be strengthened by this change. We are an independent organization now. We do have the FAA on all of our committees. They'll remain on our committees. They are a member of RTCA, and we are very grateful for that. They've put in a significant investment into becoming a member of RTCA, and are going to have a similar role to the designated federal officer on our committees. It's called the Government Authorized Representative. We're going to continue to have that relationship with them. As a matter of fact, we spoke with our luncheon speaker today, Ali Barami, who is with the FAA, and he encouraged us to continue to do the great work that we've been doing since 1935 in developing standards and bringing the industry together for consensus and performance-based standards, which is very important.
Excellent. Well, that's a great set rep for us, and I think that brings us all up to date. So thanks very much for that. Christian, is that your view, that you see this as just business as usual, or are you expecting a change to come out of this from your side?
Sure, we are looking and carefully looking what's happening here. I mean, EuroK went through changes the last 4 years. I mean, we don't have a similar day, one after the other. The environment is changing, everything is changing around us, and we see RTCA as a partner we have since I'm there. It's great working with them. Even we always thought about what's the big difference between RTCA being an advisory committee and us as in EuroK being just a standard developing organization, an SDO. I think it's not too much difference. Look at our work program. More than 50% of our activities are joint, and another 20% are at least coordinated. So we're not working on different things. So I assume it will not change too much in our relationship. It's more the opposite. It will strengthen us in making sure, and we see the benefit, especially working with you, making sure that we coordinate what goes in, and the global level is already harmonized. So it's much easier for you guys in Montreal to make sure that what's coming in, it had already some kind of international flavor.
Great. I think we're all very, very pleased to hear that from both of you. Okay, so for Christian, the question or seed question I had for you really came out of David's question there. Was we hear frequently that the standards take too long to develop. So the direct question is, do standards increase or decrease the time to certify equipment, and how? And what are some ideas for improving the pace of standards development in the world?
Slowly, I think it's because of me, because I heard exactly the same argument when I was ANC president at ICAO. So everybody said it's taking too long. Now I think we have to make sure that we have the right pace. We can't be too quick and we can't be too slow. We are not in a very comfortable situation in developing standards. That means you need to have research and development done, validated, and that provides the input in the industrialization phase, which requires standardization and which requires the regulatory frame. In addition, with the regulatory frame, as we said, the standards are complementing the regulatory frame. So we can't go ahead or we can't be behind as much. And then at the end, it needs deployment. So we are in between deployment, research and development, the industrialization phase, and that means also the industry needs to have something ready. They need to have customers. The project alone is not enough to build the standards and to have everything ready. So yes, there is something we have to take care. There was a very famous case where we were a little bit ahead of our time in developing a standard while research and development was not finalized, and we had two directions at the end of the day. We don't want to have that again. I think that was a very painful experience. In addition, we had a program at EuroK, which we started more than a year ago. We coordinated that with RTCA, which was an efficiency task force we implemented to make sure that we are reviewing all the processes and the procedures. So we did that a lot in different areas. How quickly can we, from the idea to have a kickoff meeting, how quickly, and you know, efficiency gains in all the steps. We added I think, 100% of the staff to support working groups, so technical program managers. We made sure that we are reducing the time of meetings by keeping the quality time of meetings for the experts by reducing the administrative burden. So we're doing a lot, and it's a continuous improvement process to make sure that the process is followed. But don't forget, there is a coordination work always with the regulator to make sure, wherever it comes from, to make sure that we don't have a standard which does not fit to the regulatory frame we need. And that's the really important message here.
Great, and really pleased to hear that mandate to reduce the administrative burden associated with them. I think all the industry associations would appreciate that. Al, have you got anything to add to that?
I'd like to echo what Christian said. I thought it was an excellent description of where standards fit into the timeline. And a lot of people don't recognize or may not recognize that the standards development is it's an engineering process, and it has to fit within an engineering timeline from start to finish. So it's nearly impossible to start a standard without the R&D being done ahead of time to point the direction on what is working and what isn't working. And you have to build the V&V case in order for the standard to be accepted for certification processes. And you can't do that without having some heavy lifting done ahead of time. And then on top of that, it can't be delayed to the point that the regulation is put out before the standard is complete. It has to fit within that sweet spot. It is an engineering process, and we have a physical library at RTCA of all of the documents that we've produced, stretching back to our earliest documents. And I'm struck at how the earlier you go back in time, the thinner the document. It looks more like a pamphlet. And I look at that and I say, oh, that's quite amazing. Now we're approaching 800, 900 pages for our standards. And they're very technically deep, and they're very technically sound documents. And that's a good thing, because what that means is when you go to certify and you are certifying your device based on the standard that we've written, it's going to be certified. That's the real benefit. So you shrink the tail end of that engineering process by having the standard written ahead of time. If you didn't have the standard, if everyone just went out and invented something and tried to get it certified, I can guarantee you that the time to market would be a much longer time to get there. And so this is really actually a good thing for the manufacturers and for the industry and that's, I think, why we see such involvement at RTCA and EuroK of all the original equipment manufacturers are involved very heavily, because they recognize the value that it brings to them and to the marketplace.
Terrific.
So,
David,
yeah, but I would ask the question, though, to enable innovation, quite often we don't have all the answers. However, no one would question that with innovation, whether it is in drones, supersonics, commercial space, whatever it may be, we need to maintain an equivalent level of safety. So how do we, when we're writing standards, ensure an equivalent level of safety, but knowing that we don't have all the answers, but will speed the decision-making process, which then enables the regulatory process that we just talked about. I think for the manufacturers, at least, we quite often find ourselves waiting for everybody to feel really, really comfortable and saying it's sometimes, I would say, even argue it, improved safety as opposed to equivalent, right? And that clearly slows down the process, especially when it comes to innovative technologies.
Right, so what I would suggest is that the more nascent the technology, the more innovative it is, the more people are going to have to examine that technology and how it's going to retroactively affect what else is already in the system. So from a systems engineering perspective, when you introduce something new into an extremely stable enterprise, you have to look for emergent properties that come from the inclusion not just of that technology, but how is it affecting all of the rest of the technology in there. And the less you know about this new technology, despite how it promises to improve the overall system performance, the more you have to be skeptical and you have to prove either scientifically or experimentally how that technology is actually going to keep the safety level at what it is or actually improve it. And so yes, there will be, the more innovative the technology, the longer it is going to be able to be accepted. What I would say though is having standards in place provide a boundary condition for innovation that allows you to say, if I stay within these rails, I know that I can innovate in this space here, and I want it, as long as I don't go outside the rails, I'm not going to have a problem getting my technology in there. And I think there's a lot of room for that in the technologies that we're talking about in aviation and in the drone space.
Okay, but we've got a bit of a challenge, haven't we? Just coming off our safest year ever, and we want equivalent levels of safety. It's making it more and more difficult. So I'll go back to your comment that brought a bit of laughter from the audience about the size of the documents. But when you've got a really complex system and you've got to use a lot of complicated technology to solve that, you can't expect simple solutions out of it. So I think that really is a good job that you're all doing. Okay, team, now it's your turn. Andy, where are you, Andy? I've lost you, mate. There we are. Okay, so we need you to put up your hand so that he can find you, or ask a question that you've got from the internet.
I've got several questions for you.
Okay, bring them on.
So I'm going to give you two questions. The first one is actually probably more for you.
Oh, come on.
Hey, you can't get off easy. And then the second one is something that you've dedicated at least a part of your life to that the panel may want to answer. So the first question is, how does ICAO plan to streamline incorporation of RTCA and Euro K standards into global standards? So that's for you. Yep. And then the other question is related to the aviation system block upgrades and kind of how that fits into the bigger picture, addressing some of the questions on the worldwide view of safety and innovation.
Okay, thank you. I thought I was doing the interrogation here. So the answer to the first one is actually pretty exciting for us. Under the leadership of Margaret and Christian and David Alexander at SAE International, we've been looking at the possible incorporation of camera-ready standards coming directly from industry into ICAO. Now, that's a complicated process for ICAO because we're a state-based organisation, but we believe that if we can use the Commission's process so that all states fit into the consultation process, that we have a possibility of bringing all of the elements that are required for any operational improvement into the Commission in one go. So the performance-based regulation that's needed for the annex, the technical specifications that are required for the technology and a way of certifying them, and the procedures that are required both in the air and on the ground to make it happen. So at our last Standards Roundtable meeting, we agreed on 3 candidates to have a look at whether we could get that process underway. So from our perspective, we're just taking baby steps to see whether we can bring that to the states as a way of doing business in the future. So essentially asking for industry to lead the strategic direction of what we're after, but ICAO then gets used as an organisation to get the buy-in from states and then to lead the regulatory approval capabilities within the states rather than doing any standards development ourselves. So that's the way we're headed at the moment. Christian, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, terminology again. When you talk about standards, it's standards and recommended practices, while our standards are supporting material of your SARPs, which mean guidance material, and your guidance material is done a little bit different. And I think Steve Creamer made it very clear in Brussels last time. He said the future is here. We are not going into those details anymore. And going back to the example you had before, look at ICAO Annex 8, airworthiness and certification. How much material you have really to have the regulatory framework set up. And that's the safest part of aviation. How much material do we have for airports? I think every little bulb is standardized or has a regulation in place for that. And I think here we can benefit. And I think we have already good examples from the history where you make reference to standards already today. We can do much more for that. And I think we see an overlap here, and what the industry clearly gives us, saying, yes, we want to spend resources here. We want to make sure that we have standards in place, but don't duplicate the workforce. And here we see a good possibility to do that. And I think now we have the right platform to support that. In addition, that was already a couple of times approved by the General Assembly at ICAO, so the way is paved that we can act, that we can support, that we can bring in what's already done on a regional basis, but coordinated on a global basis.
Okay, thank you. And for the second question that came through Andy, which was really about the aviation system block upgrades, I think for Peter and David, this one in particular. And I had a bit of a follow-up question that worked along the same lines, which sort of added to what you gave me there, Andy. And it was one of the premises that the ASBOs were built on was the need to have a positive business case if you wanted to drive that operational improvement. So the question really is, and I think what's coming out of it, are the ASBOs working? Are they providing a menu for the states to be able to move forward with? And secondly, is that principle of the business cases being generated before moving forward, being followed generally? And that's around the world I'm thinking of, because your organisations fly all around the world. So perhaps, Peter, if I could start with you.
We've had mixed results, some good, some bad, unfortunately, around the world. The forward-thinking countries that have strong aviation cultures, have a clear vision in the direction that they want to take air transport, are doing well. Those that are still developing, that don't have clear vision, a clear direction, it's struggling. And unfortunately, when we have these countries struggling in particular regions, it brings the entire region down. We just cannot progress at the speed that we're expecting, or the timelines that have been put in place. So in concept, I think we will all agree it's the right concept. We needed it. It was the right vision, the right plan. We're maybe 6-7 years down the line now. The execution, I think, has worked in some areas, but overall, I would say we're struggling. We just have not been able to, from a global stage, bring the majority, I won't say all, the majority of the players on board with a business case. And you certainly do need a business case to move forward. And you need to bring the entire community involved in those local markets. The NSP needs to be involved, the regulator needs to be involved, the users, the airports. It's a total system initiative. And again, we're struggling in many parts of the world. David?
Yeah, I think you summarized the issue, but I think that then you have to look at why has it not been effective. In other words, don't just say it's not as effective as we would have liked it to be. And I think it goes down to when we roll out these types of programs and we make announcements about what we need to do, we also need to have a plan to go do it. And then you need to have a willingness to understand that plan may change over time. And I think that one of the things that we're, and I would say many of us, many organizations out there, we're really good at lessons observed. We're really lousy at lessons learned. And this is a good example of, we can see it getting derailed, but we're not yet trying to put in place the effective measures to get it back to where we need to be.
If I could add one thing, I think what falters our progress is political commitment and financial commitment. And we haven't had, in many places, those two things. Without political and financial commitment, it is going to be impossible to move. Again, the vast majority of our world is not Europe and the US. They're in a very difficult and different situation. And unless you have that commitment, in most cases from the very top of those countries, it's very, very difficult to progress.
Okay, Andy, I hope that answers your question. I think from ICAO's point of view, I could add that we have a conference of all of our states coming up in October this year, and we've heard that message loud and clear, and we'll be asking for that commitment. Now, we'll see what we get out of it, but that's what we'll be asking for the next iteration of the Global Air Navigation Plan. So have you got something else for us? Yep. Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, and these are not my questions, they are questions from the audience, just to be clear in case you don't like them, okay? So you actually have about 3, but they're on kind of a similar genre, and that is about the different we would call them next gen, ATC modernization or improvements. You have 2 related to ADS-B. One is a question related to how the panel sees satellite ADS-B moving across the various continents or being implemented. And then there's probably a more specific subset of that has to do with the capability of aircraft, whether they're military or others, to comply with the mandate, which then is kind of a broader question about integration of technologies.
Okay, well, for the most part, the standard side of that house has already been done. Everything's in place, and there's nothing more that really needs to be done. So I guess it's really for our industry associations, where is the satellite-based ADS-B going to fit into the bigger picture as we go forward? So perhaps this time I'll start with you, David.
Okay, so I think it has a major place, but at the same time we're putting all this investment into ground infrastructure. So I think as we invest in that, we're going to potentially slow down the process or the near-term need to move towards a more satellite-based approach. And going to satellite is going to create a whole new and different requirements in terms of cyber, whatever, that we don't even have close to the time to get into today. I do think the other part of the question, though, in terms of the military, I think we have a decent plan, or we're going to maintain a separate route structure. I think the military, I know the U.S. military has a plan for all their civilian fleet to be fully ADS-B compliant in the correct time frame, and then we will create we'll maintain the separate military route structure.
Peter, anything to add to that?
No. From our member standpoint, oceanic operations, it's critical, particularly when we're looking for efficiencies over the Pacific, North Atlantic, South Atlantic. It's going to be critical. We need it. It's a gap that we've had. We can't further improve on operations because of that inefficiency that we have in place. So we need it. Most of the majority of the airlines that are flying across the water have the latest technology. And then I think that's part of the frustration. These manufacturers have done a fantastic job. We have all this equipment on board that can do tremendous things, but we just don't have the technology from an air traffic side or moving quick enough to start utilizing. And that's why we have the inefficiencies and the saturations across the North Atlantic, inefficiencies across the Pacific, and so on.
And I think we can all see the membership of Iridium or Aerion growing almost exponentially to address that. Christian, you got something you want to?
Yeah, we see a lot of initiatives in satellite-based solutions, not only for ADS-B or for surveillance. We see also some kind of balloon, high altitude balloons, giving a structure, a layer of surveillance. We see in navigation multi-constellation dual frequency solutions coming up soon, where we put a lot of effort in. The master plan clearly also defines a decommissioning of the ground infrastructure. I know we are speaking of that since I started my career in the 80s, and they said, look at that, it's an ADF, you will not see that any longer. It's still there, but I really think that the infrastructure the satellite-based infrastructure is getting ready and technology is here, and this will change the environment.
As long as we've got an alternative for the PNT, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, did you have one more? Okay, I've got the one that I really want to ask this panel, and really for the standards making organisations to begin with. And the point here is that the landscape is changing for the SDOs, right? The so-called tiger economies, where aviation is booming, for the moment are content to copy technology and follow the current standards. But in the very near future, we're going to see them start to innovate, and they're already heading down that track now. And for that, we need them to be into the global standards network. How are we going to bring them into the tent?
That's a really good question. And for those of you who may not follow that line of thought, we're looking at the Asian economies and China and Singapore, and they're becoming true innovators in technology and are not just buying Western equipment anymore. They're actually developing their own. And how do we involve them in the development so that we don't go down a path where we have a fractious standards landscape that manufacturers have to now develop against what's being developed in the Far East and what's happening in the US and European centric view. And that's a really good question, and we certainly invite the development of our standards are on a truly international scale. We do believe in the constructs of ICAO, and we participate in ICAO panels as far as we can. And we have some membership from that part of the world, and they're currently joining our development special committees, is what we call them, working groups for EURK, and they're assisting in the development of the standards. But I'm not sure where the future lies, if that means moving more towards the technology that they're developing and looking to their aspects, or if we just bring them under our tent and try to convince them to that we have the answers. I just don't know what the future holds in that arena. It's exciting, though, I can tell you that.
No, we're going to have to start thinking about it.
We are.
The speed is not the same, that's clearly. They are not joining as quickly as they're having the industry built up. That's really something we're seeing, and we also see that there is more we have to do, and I agree with you, we need to find a way. We try to work with them, we do as much as we can here, but don't forget that you develop a good standard. You need a variety of industry, you need the operators, you need a different set of experts. You can't do it, when you have one industry. We have to learn that we learned that in Europe, it's not so easy to establish that. And that's the reason it's always good to complement each other on both sides of the Atlantic. And sometimes we have more industry in Europe, or you have more industry here in the US, and you take the lead on different initiatives. And that might change in the future when we take also this part of the world into account. But it's not only China, it's not Japan, it's also Australia and New Zealand. They are just far, far away. You know how far, Maka? And we also have an industry in Russia and in the Ukraine. Don't forget that. Those airplanes are flying since a long time. And that's the same.
Okay, so we've clearly got a fair bit of work to do there. Look, I've got another 10 questions. I'm sure the audience does too, but our clock says 000, and I wish we had a bit more time to spend interrogating you guys, but we don't, Andy. So if you could just join me to thank our panel very much for the efforts.